Well, g'day Melbourne. Woo! I came a long way to do this, and I'm excited to be here. So I'm going to be talking about event storming. Event storming is a relatively recent thing, just in the last maybe 2 or 3 years has started to come along, and it's a technique that helps teams that are working in, as I put up there, complex domains. So if you're working in a business that has a lot of complexity in the way the business works, in the way it functions, if you're dealing not only with that type of business complexity, but you're struggling with maybe legacy systems, code that's been around for a while that you're trying to integrate together, you're trying to maybe do innovation work on top of or alongside those, you're checking all the boxes on that, right? Then this can really help, because what I've found over the past couple of years is I've been experimenting with event storming and applying this technique with teams, is seeing that gap between the business and the technical teams start to get bridged in ways that I hadn't seen before, and a new level of, as we put up there, collaborative learning that is happening between that. So my goal at the end of this talk is to help you understand what is event storming, how it might help your team, and give you some tips if you decide. I'd love for you to go away, some of you, and try it out with your team. And so I'll give you some tips on how to facilitate an event storming session as well, and some resources for that. So that's kind of where we're going with this talk. Event storming, the book Introducing Event Storming is available on LeanPub. It's published by Alberto Brandolini. So you know, like all things on LeanPub, it's mostly done, right? It's at a certain percentage, but there's still a lot of information in there. My background is in domain-driven design. That's what I've been doing for almost 10 years now, is kind of my main area. And in the DDD book, the Domain-Driven Design book, Eric Evans says that the critical complexity of most software development is not in the technology, it's actually in understanding the domain itself. That's the stuff that's really hard. And as technical people, we're not really given a lot of tools for being able to pull that off. In fact, I'm not sure if this looks familiar to you, so who knows what this is? Rosetta Stone, right? It's in the British Museum. I saw it in June again. So the Rosetta Stone is very famous because it's got 3 languages on it, and it's the first archaeological artifact that allowed scholars to figure out how to read Egyptian hieroglyphics. Up until this point, no one understood what was printed on the inside of the pyramids and, you know, the other places where they found Egyptian hieroglyphics. And because this provided a translation of the same text between hieroglyphics, Demotic script, and Greek, they were able to take what they knew and actually work that into the other language. And the reason why I put this up here is because I find myself often seeing teams in this kind of situation, right, where they speak Greek, right? They speak Angular, and they speak REST, and they speak all this technical stuff. And then you've got the people on the business side, and it's all hieroglyphics, right? So it's, you know, talking about invoices and purchase orders, or whatever your business domain is about, and how do we bridge the gap between those two? And that's a core concern within domain-driven design, and something that event storming really helps with. So let's talk about what event storming actually is. The idea with event storming is that you place events on a timeline. So what do we mean by an event? So what we're talking about in domain-driven design terms is a domain event. We represent that in event storming on an orange sticky, and we give people Sharpies, and they write these events in the past tense on these stickies. So you might say, well, why do we write it in the past tense? Well, it's an event, it's a fact, it's something that's already happened, right? You don't change it because it has already happened. So it's, you know, unless you have a TARDIS or a flux capacitor and a DeLorean or something like that, but we don't want to go there, right? So the idea is that these domain events aren't necessarily things that you would find in a log file. They're actually things that the business experts care about, what we would call the domain experts. So the people on the business side are saying what kinds of things they might care about. So let's look at some examples of what we mean by a domain event. So we said, something that happened in the business that domain experts care about. That's what we're talking about when we talk about domain events. And then we put them on orange stickies. So here's a simple example. We've got a sticky that represents an event, a time-based event, so end of month, right? And then we have billable amount calculated is something that happens at the end of the month. And then we want to verify the billable amount, so we have a billable amount verified event. And then finally, assuming those things go well, we have an invoice prepared, okay? So the idea is that we place these events chronologically from the earliest one to the latest one on some kind of modeling surface. So in terms of what types of events there are, so let's talk about species of domain events. So the most common one that I find is some kind of step in a business process. So some examples of that might be customer orders submitted. We have things like the customer paid a certain amount. So if we're talking about e-commerce or something, it might be like that. Order completed, item shipped, those kinds of things would be steps in a business process. Maybe some kind of approval step if it's something that's being published or something like that. Secondly, something that happens on a scheduled basis. So we talked about like end of month or something like that. It might be nightly account reconciliation if you're working in a transactional kind of industry. So we have steps in a business process, we have things that happen on a regular scheduled basis. And then one of the interesting things about events is that events can actually trigger other events, right? So in the US, when I talk about this, I usually talk about baseball, right? So in baseball, you have strike one, and then they swing and miss. What is it? Strike two, strike three, and then a different type of event gets triggered after strike three. What is it? You're out, right? And then 3 outs triggers side away, 2 side aways trigger end of innings, right? So you have this flow of events. In terms of an example, maybe from a technical domain, it would be something like a customer tries to log in 3 times in a sequence and gets the password wrong, and so the next event would be account locked or something like that, right? And we see this pattern very commonly in our systems as well. We're probably not used to thinking about our systems in terms of events. I think our industry's done such a great job of telling us to model in terms of structure, to model in terms of objects and nouns and verbs and that type of thing, and to think about database structure. And those are all important things, but with EventStorming, we're focused on something else. We're focused on changes in state over time. So when we do EventStorming, provide unlimited modeling space. What do I mean by that? I have an IKEA roll of butcher's paper that I'll typically put up on the wall, like that. I want to provide it to be, I don't know how big this modeling is going to get ahead of time, so I want people to feel like they can spread out and put these stickies anywhere they need to. When they come into the room for an EventStorming session, they'll see the butcher's paper on the wall, they'll see a big visible legend that explains the different color codes for the different stickies and the examples of those, and there'll be a whole pile of supplies there for them to use. So the idea is that we have our modeling space and we start with a single event and then we start to branch out from there. So what happened that triggered this event? What caused this event? What happens after this event? What are the results from that, right? So you think about it in terms of putting the first event up, maybe it's the last one, right? So in this case, think about the story of Cinderella, right? They lived happily ever after. And then what does it start with? It's a fairy tale, so this is not usually how software development goes, right? It's usually something bad happens at the end or something like that. But hopefully there's something good that happens, right? But you have this situation where these are domain events. They lived happily ever after, right? It's in the past tense. It's something that's happened. And then if you think about the story of Cinderella, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens between those two things. But who knows ahead of time when we go into a workshop like this how much detail we need to go down to or whatever area we need to focus on. So I like to have a big space there because I don't know how much space we're going to use up. So in terms of an EventStorming session, we want to invite the right people. So who do we mean by that? Well, we need to, if we know what kind of problem we're trying to solve, what kind of thing we're sort of digging into, we want to make sure that we have people from the business side that understand that part of the business and what they're trying to do. So they understand the business process. I rarely find somebody that knows the whole thing end to end, right? It's usually several people that have different areas of expertise and they kind of somewhat overlap, but I want to make sure that I have a few people in the room So you can see this is a team that's just getting started with an event storming session. So this is actually a mixture of developers, there's an architect, there's several people there that are experts in this particular business domain, and they're having conversations around, they're putting up these orange stickies representing events, and then they're having conversations around those. And what they're doing is they're building up this visual map of this timeline as an artifact that they can talk about as they go along, right? So it's really hard to, I've tried videoing event storming sessions, and you're really just seeing people writing on stickies and sticking them on the wall and talking to each other, and it doesn't really capture the energy that I feel in the room when I'm part of one of these sessions. So I did something a little different a couple of months ago and actually time-lapsed an event storming session. So this, you can see here we've got all the supplies. We've actually got output from a previous event storming session down the bottom, because what this team is doing is they want to develop some new features, and they had mapped out this previous process that's kind of similar to the one that they're going to be working on, but a little bit different. So they wanted to have it to reference. So we put that underneath the blank section they're going to be working on. And what I've done is I've, as the facilitator, seeded the wall with a single event. So what I'd like to do at the start is I'll say, okay, what's something that a domain expert cares about? And then I'll just write it down and stick it up on the wall. And what's something that happens after that? And I might seed that, and then maybe another one, and then basically say, okay, now that I've explained how this works, go. So this is what it kind of feels like when you do event storming. So this is about 10 or 15 people all collaborating together. You can see that they're building up this map very quickly on the wall in terms of the events. They've also got some pink stickies there that we'll talk about in a little bit. This is a little bit more of the session as it goes on. So what people are doing is they're writing down these events, they're sticking them up on the wall, and then as they have questions, as there are things they're not sure of, they talk about them. But the idea is that they're building up this timeline first, and they're reviewing what each other are doing, and they're moving around the wall to get a feel for what's going on in that whole process. And then at various points they're stopping and saying, well, which is the part that we really care about in terms of these new features? Like what's in scope in this process and what's out of scope? So all these kind of conversations are happening in real time with the team. And as a facilitator, and I'll talk about this more later, but I tend to have a fairly, like I know what's going on and I'm interacting with people and I'm asking questions, but I don't know anything about this business domain. So my role is really just to facilitate that, to provide an environment where people can have the right conversations they need to have. And make sure that certain people aren't dominating the room as much as maybe they would like to, and that we're taking breaks and things like that. So that's a little bit what it feels like in terms of event storming. So you can see the difference between that and, like, I've been in meetings where the developers will say, okay, so we need to figure out this particular part of our business domain. And they walk up to the whiteboard and they start sketching some really detailed UML, right? Or a database diagram or something like that. And what I tend to see is the business people's eyes start to glaze over, right? Because now we're in the technical realm and this isn't really speaking their language anymore. But what I've consistently found with event storming is that they're the ones that are leading the conversations, right? They're the ones that are saying, oh, this event here actually relates to this one way over here, and this one actually repeats, and this one actually loops back around to here. So how do we deal with that? And related to that is we have orange stickies for domain events, and then usually I just introduce right from the beginning orange stickies and pink stickies, and I start with that. And we do a first round where those are the only two colors. When I'm doing this with the team for the first time, I said these are the only two colors you need to worry about. So basically capture the timeline, the sequence of behavior with the orange stickies, and then use the pink stickies to capture the stuff you don't know or you're not sure of. Or maybe you're having to assume just for the sake of argument, right? So if you have a question about something, write down the question and stick it up on the timeline. And so what we tend to do as we build that up is we start to see areas where there are problems, potential problems, potential risks, potential concerns that people have. And as you start to build up this map, it starts to become clear kind of what you might call the hotspots are in this process. Sometimes the right solution is not to write any software for that part of the process at all, but to look at the process itself and say, we need to improve this because this doesn't make sense anymore, right? With this particular team that I was showing in the time lapse, there was a whole section of the process that they said, you know, we're not even really touching this part of the process. This is our legacy system, and we don't even really have, this is kind of out of scope for us, but there were a lot of things that were kind of downstream from where they were going to be working that were going to be impacted by the work. And so it came out in the pink stickies of things like that. Other things that come out is confusion around terminology. Okay, so does this domain event that talks about a claim relate to this domain event that talks about a claim? Are they the same thing? Okay, so gave an example of event storming some new functionality and what that looks like for a team. Another thing that I found event storming very helpful for is working with applications that have been around for a long time, particularly large applications. So this might sound familiar. You might have the situation where you're working on code that 5, 10 years old. It's been developed by many people over the course of a long period of time, and maybe it doesn't quite hang together the way it should. Maybe there are parts of this application that don't make quite as much sense as you would like them to make, and these applications that are sort of large and distributed and integrating with third-party things. So how do you deal with that? So the one that I'm going to show, and it's just a photo of what the map looked like after we were finished, but I was working with an architect on a team, and this was a large-scale Internet of Things application that had been developed over about 9 years. It's still in active production today. And this application dealt with different types of devices. And if you think about it as different categories of devices, so maybe you need to be able to add video cameras, webcams to this application, and you need to be able to add thermostats and other devices like that. And that whole process of adding devices and having the system recognize them, it was almost like each different category of device had a different way of going through that process of being added to the system. And it was really hard to get that big picture view of what's going on here, because it was actually separate modules, separate sections of code for each different category of device, and each different module had been written by different groups of people. So we spent a couple of hours, just the two of us, mapping all this out to see what it would look like and to try and get some kind of feel for the big picture patterns in terms of what it looked like. So this is actually, that top row is one category of devices, and then we have another one on the left there, and then further over on the right we have another one. And even maybe right down the back, you can see there's some common patterns in terms of the flow there, but we also noticed some pretty drastic differences in terms of the way each of these have been implemented. Because we were trying to figure out what opportunities are there maybe to consolidate some of this code, or at least handle it in the same way in terms of this process. So EventStorming was really helpful for that. Here's Dan, the architect that I worked with on this, walking the rest of the team through what we had come out with. So this EventStorming felt very different from the one I showed you before, because it wasn't 10 or 15 people in a room with business experts. This was actually walking through an established system, very much from a technical perspective, and a very technical business domain, right? Dan is actually the domain expert in this case, because he's the one that understands the intricacies of how you integrate all these different devices together. Now you can see on this, there are actually other colors other than just orange and pink. So let's talk about some of those other kinds of interactions that we can model with event storming. So one very common one is I have a persona or some kind of user that is doing something and interacting with the software in that way. So how do we represent that? So what we use is yellow stickies to represent personas or users of some type. And then when that person performs that action, whatever it is, like submit invoice, we use a blue sticky to represent that decision or that command that's happening with the system. So if you're working on a system where you're using the command pattern, this will look very familiar because that's basically what these blue stickies represent, is an imperative to do something. Tell the system to do something. Submit invoice. Publish workflow item. That's a command. It's something that you are telling the system to do. And then the thing that's interesting about commands is commands often lead to one or more events. Right? So there's often a parity between something like submit invoice and then an event that says invoice submitted. Right? Especially if you're using a type of architecture that is event-based. So we have blues for commands, we have yellow for users. I really enjoy working with teams that have well-established personas in terms of user experience design because it makes this type of workshop go much, much more smoothly because people really understand what the personas mean, what kind of archetype of user they represent, and it just makes it flow so much better, and the understanding level is so much higher. Now the other thing is, so we've got these commands that are going in, being represented with the blue stickies, but the users, the personas, they need information, they need data to be able to make those kinds of decisions. So how do we represent those? We use green stickies to represent what we would call a read model or some kind of data that the user would be interested in. Something that gets displayed on the screen is represented with a green sticky. So the idea with these is that the user needs to make a decision. So what are we going to present on the screen that's actually going to allow us to do that? And if you're working in a system that is fundamentally event-based, or you're working in a functional language, then this green sticky often takes the form of some kind of projection of the state of the data. Right? So if you're representing a particular item like an invoice as a series of events in your system, then you would need to create a projection to figure out what the current state of that object is and present that as a green read model. And we can talk more about that. If people are interested in that, then you can ask me some questions at the end of the talk about that. So you can see here people going through and using the different coloured stickies. They're putting up pink stickies because there are things they just don't understand. They're mapping out. They've got a list of personas up the top that they're referring to. And even though you don't know anything at all about this particular domain, you can see that there are certain areas up there that are more problematic than others in terms of the team's level of understanding, right? So somewhere towards the beginning here, and then over here towards the end, there are more pink stickies. So that's an indication that it could be several things. So if I see a lot of pink stickies, it indicates that, well, maybe the person that knows the answer to those questions just wasn't in the room. So do we need to schedule a follow-up workshop or some kind of action item to chase up that person to find out? It could just mean that maybe the team doesn't know the answer at all. Sometimes I do event storming workshops with a team and we end up with more pink stickies than we do orange stickies, right? So the appropriate next action is probably not go to your IDE and start coding, right? Because it means that your level of ignorance is actually so much higher than your knowledge level in terms of what problem you're trying to solve. So that's actually a good outcome for an event storming workshop as well, because if we get to the end of an hour and all we have is a sea of pink stickies, then we know that we've got a lot more work that we need to do to figure out even what it is that we're trying to build. And that's a good outcome because you rather find that out early than later. And the nice thing is that because you have the relevant people from the business and the relevant people from the team in the room, then it's easy to have that kind of consensus of, yeah, we're not ready to move forward with this yet. We've got some more work to do. That work might take the place that we need to do some prototyping. Maybe we need to talk to the business a bit more. Maybe we need to think a bit more carefully about what we're trying to solve. Maybe we need to find out who needed to be in the room and do another session with them. So there are some common patterns around where domain events come from. So I already mentioned the first one is maybe it's some kind of action that is started by a user. And like we said, so that would be a yellow sticky representing that user, whatever that name is of that persona. and then the command. So that's a very common source for events. And often, as a team is doing event storming, if I see event just dangling out there, I'll say, so what caused that? Did somebody do something that actually led to that event happening, right? Because it's very rare for events to just pop out of the ether. So one of the most common ways is having some kind of command, some kind of decision that gets made by a user. Another very common one is, and we represent these with kind of a lilac color or a purple, is we have events that are coming in from external systems. And this could be any kind of external system. So this could be something like some payment gateway sending back a response. It could be a system that is still within your company but is external to the particular application that you're working on. So this allows us to kind of really start to get into not just what is the user-facing behavior, but what's actually going on behind the scenes with this, right? What are the actual events that are coming in from other systems that are causing things to happen in our application or that we need to respond to in our application? So being able to model those interactions with things that are kind of outside our sphere and define what is the boundary of our system and then model that boundary by using a flow of events so we can keep those systems loosely coupled and actually have a good interface between our system and whatever that other system is. I mentioned this one already, is maybe it's just time passing. So maybe it's some kind of scheduled regular event or something like that. I worked with a team recently where they had to, if no action was taken on a certain item within 90 days, something needed to happen, right? Who has that kind of pattern in your domain? Yeah, it's a very common one, right? Is a certain period of time goes by with no action or a certain type of action and then something else needs to be triggered. So you can model that. You can have a domain event that says 90 days passed, right? Or 1 week elapsed is an event, right? And then you can then say, okay, well then what happens once that event gets triggered and model that from there. So this is a very powerful technique because most teams do not think this way about their domain, right? What we're actually talking about here is we're modeling chronology, right? We're actually modeling time. And that's not the way that I was ever taught to think about software development. I was always taught to think about structure and, what is the form of things? How do I persist them? That type of thing. But that's not where all the interesting stuff happens in our software. And that's not generally where the bugs are, right? I mean, how many bugs happen in your system when data's not doing anything? Right? Very few, right? It's when stuff changes that stuff breaks. So what we're trying to do with event storming and an event-based approach is to actually capture those meaningful changes and model them. And then I already mentioned this one as well, is that sometimes one event triggers another, or a sequence of events triggers another event. So these are kind of 4 very common patterns, and things that I look for when I'm doing an event storming session with a team is, for each event that's up there, how did it get there? We can also visualize business rules. So we might have a situation where maybe there's some kind of rule that needs to be applied. If you hear someone in an event storming session say, well, whenever this happens, we need to do this, it's a policy. And so we use this color for that, right? A lilac-y color once again. So whenever someone says, well, whenever the price exceeds a certain amount, we need to perform some other kind of action, then what you've got is a policy that's leading to some kind of command, which then triggers a sequence of events. So that's a very common pattern as well. So this allows us to model those kinds of business rules or process managers or long-running processes through something like this as a policy. So when I'm facilitating an event storming session, what am I doing? Am I just kind of standing there? I tend to ask a lot of questions. So if I see an event there and it's just hanging there, I'll say, well, what circumstances caused this event to happen? How did we get to where we are right now? Another way of saying that, sometimes I'll say, well, what was the path that led us to here? Another way of saying that is that when you have a certain event there, that assumes a whole context that maybe hasn't been shown yet. So I'll often say, tell me the story of how we got to where we are right now. And then I might ask, well, are there other ways to get to where we are in terms of this event? So what we're talking about here is exploration, right? Is understanding what that timeline looks like and starting to dig into that. Another one is, can you give me a good example of something? So this is a really, really powerful question for technical people, because we as technical people tend to focus very much on the technical aspects, and sometimes we're not so good in terms of interacting with people on the business side. So asking a simple question like, well, can you give me an example of what a limit of liability is? What does that mean? Can you give me an example of that? Is a really powerful way of being able to dig into these domain concepts, these business terms that everyone thinks they understand until they have to explain them. And then you realize, maybe I don't understand that as well as I thought. Other questions is, what do you mean by whatever that term is? So what do you mean by limit of liability? What do you mean by appraisal? What do you mean by this particular term? Another one, what might lead someone to submit this invoice, or what might lead someone to perform this action? So these are all great questions to ask. Same with what else might happen, right? So often when teams are doing this for the first time and they sketch up that series of events, it's very much a happy path kind of situation of, here's how it's supposed to work. So then once we've got that, I say, okay, what else might happen here, right? And then where might that lead us? And that may involve taking kind of a different swim lane in terms of the map, or it might say, oh, that's a completely different thing. Okay, well, let's start somewhere else on the modeling space and see where that takes us. All right, so let me give you some tips. Tips for facilitation. I've had to kind of learn facilitation mostly through making a lot of mistakes along the way, so hopefully I can help you avoid some of those. One of the mistakes that a lot of people that have never run this type of workshop before make is that they think that the goal of the meeting is to drive to a decision, right? And that's what most meetings are like, is we're trying to get to a decision on this thing. But that's not what an event storming session is about. An event storming session is really about exploration and learning, and you do converge on things at the end, but it takes a different form. If that doesn't make sense to you, I'm going to give you a couple of resources to take a look at, and I'm going to give you a thinking tool for that. So these two books, Game Storming and Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making, which is quite a mouthful, but it's useful. If you're only going to buy one of those, get Game Storming. Particularly if you find yourself either as a Scrum Master or focusing on Agile coaching or anything like that. It's an invaluable book for these types of things. And in Game Storming, they basically say every game follows the same pattern. In every game, when you're trying to get from a known place, you're trying to get from A to B. A is known, that's where we are right now, and B is where we want to get to, but we're not really sure what that is. It's a little fuzzy. And what we want to do when we start out is we want to get a bunch of ideas out there very fast. And so in event storming, what that means is everyone gets an orange pad and a Sharpie, and I just say, just start writing down events and just start posting them up on the wall. Don't worry about what everyone else is doing. Just come up with ideas and start posting them up, right? And so I'm trying to get that kind of opening of people diverging and getting a lot of ideas out there. And then as we get towards the end of the workshop, the idea is, okay, what have we learned? And start to converge on what are our next steps. So maybe that's pink stickies around, okay, we've got a bunch of pink stickies here that represent questions that we have, so we need to take action items on those. We need to do a bit more research. Maybe we need to do some prototyping in code. So the idea is we've got an opening and a closing in every game that we play. And then at the start, you want to diverge and get a bunch of ideas out on the table. And at the end, you want to converge on what was our learning, and where do we go from here? But there's this whole middle section here that I think is actually, to me, is the more interesting bit. And the way that tends to feel to me, particularly with event storming, is we get to the point where we've got a few stickies up there, and now it's time to really start to explore. And this is the bit where people start feeling uncomfortable, because it feels a little bit chaotic, right? It feels like we're not really sure what we're doing. And the reality is that that's actually kind of true, right? Because it's exploration. You don't know where you're going. So you might say, well, I'm going to pick this particular idea and I'm going to explore this sequence of events and do a little bit of digging into that. And okay, we've gone deep enough on that. Let's go to this other area over here and do a little bit of exploration. So we're really trying to focus on learning, trying to focus on discovery. What don't we know? And then what I tend to find is this is where the ideas start to emerge, right? This is where the interesting, what if we did it this way? What if we actually approached it a different way? What if we modeled this concept differently? Or, there seems to be a concept missing in the way that this process works. What is that? Sometimes it's a domain expert, someone from the business says a certain thing. Like, they might say something like, the most important idea here is, and then they mention some concept. And I look at the wall and I say, well, where is that concept up on the wall? And everyone just looks at all the events and says, it's not really there. It's like, okay, well, let's go back to the wall and see what that would look like if we incorporated that into the model, incorporated that into the timeline. So I find this a helpful kind of model for thinking about this, is that there's this bit that's going to be in the middle there where we're doing exploration, we're trying to focus on discovery. That's going to be a little bit uncomfortable for people, and that's what I actually tell them at the start of an event storming session is, we're going to start out and get a lot of ideas out there right at the beginning, and we're going to converge at the end, but there's going to be this bit in the middle that's going to feel a little bit weird, and that's okay. If you've never done it before, it's all right. It's a bit like any game you play, right? If you ever watch basketball, there's like the starting plays, and then there's the stuff that happens at the end, and then there's this whole middle section of the game where they just seem to be running from one end to the other, right? But that's actually the exciting part of the game, if you know the rules and you understand how it works. So what are some tips for event storming? So firstly is, this is not about necessarily driving to consensus or making a decision. This is about getting people in the room and focusing on learning from each other and understanding the problem domain. So really understanding the problem. Related to that is, what I like to do is I like to get teams to actually talk through a concrete, realistic business example. So don't do something abstract. Actually pick something that is realistic and talk about a particular persona, maybe purchasing a certain item online, and then I say, well, what item is it? Oh, it's a pair of shoes. What kind of shoes? How much did they pay for it? Start drilling into some of those details, because what I often find is that it's easy to get rid of details as you find they're irrelevant, but it's very hard to put them in after you've kind of abstracted them away right from the beginning. And I never know ahead of time which details are important and which ones aren't. Another thing is that you want to build on each other's ideas. So the idea is that if somebody writes a certain sticky, then I like to move people around the wall so they can see what's going on and actually build on that. Related to that is I time box these fairly ruthlessly. So I make sure that we have regular breaks, and I make sure people know what, like I put up kind of a rough agenda at the beginning so people know how long it's going to go for. And if the energy level starts to flag, then I'll say, okay, let's take a break or something like that. A couple more things is that the conversations and the examples that people talk about are the things I want them to focus on. So the conversations that happen in this type of session, in this type of workshop, are really, really important and really critical. And what the timeline allows you to do is to have something that's outside of yourself that you can actually look at and talk about objectively and fix and tweak and improve. Related to that is the idea that you want people to be putting things up on the timeline first and then asking questions, right? I find a lot of teams get in a situation where there's someone in the room that wants to always talk about what they're going to write before they write it. And all of a sudden, like 3 or 4 people about them are all having the conversation about that thing, but it's not up on the wall yet. It's still just an idea in that person's head. So it doesn't have a location in the timeline, it doesn't have a description, it doesn't have anything that's kind of outside of those people that they can point to and talk about. So one of the rules that I always say at the start of an event storming session is post first, ask questions later. So if you have a question, if you have an idea, write it down first, put it somewhere on the wall, even if you're not sure where it is, and then ask the question, because then you can have a conversation about something that is outside of yourself. And this is a really, really powerful technique, especially for questions. Right? Have you ever been in those meetings where someone just always has tons and tons of questions and it just goes down rabbit trails, and you get to the end of the time and you're like, well, that was just a complete waste of time. We just, that person kind of ran the meeting. So what this allows us to do is to use the pink stickies as a mechanism of saying, oh, that's a really good question. Do we know the answer to that right now? Doesn't sound like it. Okay, let's just leave it up on the wall and move on, right? So it's a really powerful way of kind of deferring those kinds of things. So like I said at the beginning, I found event storming to be a really powerful technique. It's really fun, I find. It leads to a lot of energy in the room, and it takes the type of domain modeling that I really care about and I really enjoy, and sort of takes it to a new level. So there's 3 kind of key wins that I've seen out of event storming. The first one is the collaborative learning that happens. So just being able to have technical people and people from the business in the room together having these kinds of conversations is just such a powerful thing. And it allows us to get everyone to a certain level of shared understanding very, very quickly, like surprisingly quickly. And that's a really, really powerful thing that you want to encourage. The other thing I mentioned at the beginning, if you're working in a really complex business domain, if there's a lot of rules, if there's a lot of interactions with legacy systems, with third parties, it allows you to model that mess up on the wall so that everyone can see it and have a conversation around it. And you can combine it with other techniques, like in domain-driven design, there's the notion of context mapping. So you can combine it with context mapping to be able to explain to people from the business what's going on. You get a high level of engagement than I've seen with just about anything else with event storming, because everyone's moving around, there's a lot of energy, it's tactile, it's physical, and you're focusing not on, as I've said before, not on structure and form, but on behavior and outcomes. And I think if there's nothing else you take away from this, is that idea that focusing on events allows you to focus on behavior and outcomes in a way that other types of modeling doesn't. And then the third thing is that I found with each time I've done this with teams, it's led to better solutions, right? Because you can't have a solution that meets a need if you don't actually understand what the need is. So event storming actually allows you to dig into that need and really understand it. It helps you see where there are missing concepts, where there are misunderstandings, and do it very, very quickly, and in the process avoid some rework.